Hello everyone. I am here to help you today to fall asleep. So before we get started, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know, where are you from and what time are you watching this? Now get comfortable and relax. Name of the story: The Diary of Apartment 7B. It was one of those quiet, gray mornings that crept into the city, casting a dull, lifeless hue over everything. Mark had just moved into his new apartment in the dilapidated building on 7th Avenue. The place had been affordable, a small one-bedroom with creaky floorboards and a musty smell that seemed to settle into the corners of the room. He had been living there for just a few days, and so far, nothing about the apartment seemed unusual, apart from the eerie silence that blanketed the entire building. There were no neighbors knocking on his door to welcome him, no sounds of laughter or conversation echoing down the hallways. It felt lonely. Mark set about his day unpacking boxes and setting up furniture. It was an uneventful start to what he hoped would be a fresh chapter in his life. As he placed his coffee mug on the kitchen counter, something caught his eye: a small, old leather-bound book wedged between the cracks of the wall and the wooden cabinet. Curious, he reached for it, dusting off the thick layer of grime that had built up over the years. It was a diary, its pages yellowed with age, and the binding seemed fragile, as though it could disintegrate at the slightest touch. The front cover had no title, only a faded embossed symbol that Mark couldn't quite make out. Intrigued, he flipped it open. The first entry was dated only a few months ago, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. The building feels strange tonight. The air is thick with something I can't explain. It's as if the walls are watching me, waiting for something. I know I'm being paranoid, but I can't shake the feeling that something's in the dark corners, listening. I'm sure of it. I'm starting to hear things. At first, I thought it was just the neighbors, but no, it's something else. A whisper, a movement, something in the shadows. Mark furrowed his brow. It sounded odd, but he had to admit there was a certain coldness to the apartment, something that made his skin crawl when the silence stretched too long. But he brushed it off as just his imagination. The next entry, however, was much more disturbing. It happened again last night. I woke up to the sound of the door creaking open, slowly, like someone was sneaking into my room. I called out, thinking it was just my roommate, but no one answered. The room was empty. I don't know what's happening to me. I can't remember when I last felt truly safe here. The whispers are louder now. They're closer. Mark's pulse quickened. He shifted uncomfortably on the couch, looking around the apartment as if the walls themselves might be listening. He couldn't remember hearing any strange sounds at night, but there had been a certain unsettling stillness in the apartment that made him uneasy. He flipped through the pages. The entries grew darker, more erratic. I've seen it tonight. The shadow in the hallway. It's not human, not entirely. It moves just out of the corner of my eye, always in the dark, always lurking just out of reach. I don't know what it wants, but it's getting closer. Mark felt a chill spread down his spine. The words seemed to resonate with something inside him, an echo of his own unease. Was it possible that the previous tenant had felt the same way? Was there something in this apartment that could make someone feel watched? The next few pages were a blur of frantic scribblings, the handwriting becoming more erratic and barely legible, as if the writer's sanity was unraveling. I can't stay here any longer. It's too much. I hear it. The thing in the hallway. It's watching me. Every night it gets closer. I can hear it breathing. I can't leave. I've tried, but the door, it won't open. The lock is stuck. It's stuck. I know I can't escape. I'm trapped. Trapped with it. Mark slammed the diary shut. His hands were shaking, his heart racing. This had to be some sick joke. But the truth was, the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had been hearing things too. Soft footsteps late at night, a door creaking open when there was no one around. He stared at the door leading to the hallway, his eyes flicking nervously to the shadows stretching across the walls. Had he really been imagining things? Or was there something more to the strange diary? Unable to shake the unease gnawing at him, Mark decided to investigate. The building had been quiet, but maybe too quiet. Maybe he wasn't alone. He stood up, taking a deep breath, his hand resting on the door handle. With one last glance at the diary, he opened the door and stepped into the hallway. It was as silent as ever, the dim yellow lights flickering overhead. Mark's footsteps echoed down the corridor, but there was something wrong, something faintly off, as if the air had thickened, become heavier. A shiver ran down his spine. Was someone watching him? Mark turned back to the apartment door. It was still open behind him, the shadows in the hallway stretching long and unnatural. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. Heart pounding, Mark tried to turn the handle. It was stuck, just like the entry in the diary had described. Panic surged through him. The whispering began, low at first, then louder, as though something was right behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, a voice, harsh and guttural, whispered in his ear. "Leave. Leave now, or you will never leave at all." Frozen, Mark's body went cold with terror. What was that thing? What was it? And just like that, the lights in the hallway flickered, plunging the corridor into darkness. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the darkness engulfed him. The whispering had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, and every shadow seemed to stretch longer, more twisted, as if they were reaching for him. He tugged again at the door handle, desperate, but the door remained stubbornly shut, refusing to budge. Sweat pooled at the back of his neck, and his pulse quickened as panic clawed at his chest. This couldn't be happening. He was just imagining things, right? He stumbled back, his feet shuffling across the cold wooden floor of the hallway. His hand grazed the wall as he tried to steady himself. The air felt wrong, too thick, too heavy, as if something unseen was pressing in on him. The lights above flickered again, the glow weak and intermittent, casting long, twitching shadows on the walls. In the midst of the darkness, Mark caught sight of something at the far end of the hallway. A figure standing motionless. He could barely make it out, but there was something horribly familiar about it, something that sent a wave of nausea rushing through him. It was as though it was waiting for him. His throat tightened, and he took a hesitant step forward, his legs shaking beneath him. The figure remained still, not moving, but Mark could feel its gaze. It was like it was watching him, measuring him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Who are you?" Mark found himself whispering, his voice barely audible in the eerie stillness of the hallway. There was no answer, but the figure didn't need to speak. The pressure in the air grew heavier with every passing second, until it felt like the entire hallway was closing in on him. The shadows twisted and writhed, moving unnaturally as though they had a life of their own. Then suddenly the figure began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, faster than Mark could comprehend. It darted toward him with a terrifying speed, its form an indistinct blur in the dim light. A shadow, but not just any shadow. A shadow that seemed to take shape, a dark, formless creature that reached out with long, skeletal arms. Mark's heart raced. His legs froze, paralyzed by fear. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature was almost upon him now, its mouth stretching wide, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the lingering chill of its presence. Mark stood there, his body trembling, his breath shallow. The hallway was empty again, the darkness stretching back into the corners of the building. But he knew deep down that it wasn't gone. It was still there, watching him. Without thinking, Mark ran, his feet pounding against the floor as he sprinted down the hallway. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, too jumbled to make sense of. He needed to get out of there, needed to escape, but the building seemed to stretch on forever. The hallways twisted and turned in unnatural ways, as though they were leading him deeper into the heart of the nightmare. He didn't know where he was going, but he kept running. The only sound was the frantic rhythm of his footsteps, echoing in the empty hallways. The air grew colder with every step he took, and the whispers returned, low and insistent, like a chorus of voices just out of reach. And then in the distance he saw something. A door slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from the crack. He ran toward it, desperate for any escape, but as he reached for the handle, a cold hand gripped his wrist. He spun around, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, but the hand, the touch, it was real. Mark tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, pulling him into the shadows. He struggled, but it was as if the darkness itself was alive, holding him in place. The whispers grew louder, deafening, until they felt like they were coming from inside his own head. Leave, or you will never leave. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He had to get out. He had to leave. With every ounce of strength he had left, he wrenched himself free from the grip of the shadows and stumbled back toward the apartment door. The hallway seemed to stretch farther now, the walls closing in around him, suffocating him. When he reached the door, he didn't hesitate. He threw his shoulder against it, slamming it open, and bolted inside. The apartment was still as he had left it. The faint light from the kitchen illuminated the space, casting long shadows across the room. But there was something wrong. The air felt thick with an unnatural weight, and the silence was deafening. Mark stood in the doorway, staring into the apartment, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His eyes darted around the room, and then he saw it. A shadow, not from the light, but from the corner of the room. It was small at first, a flicker of movement, but it grew larger with each passing second. It took shape slowly, and Mark realized, horror flooding his veins, that it was a figure. A dark, twisted shape. And then the figure moved. Not slowly, not cautiously. It lunged toward him, a blur of darkness, and Mark screamed. He spun around, slamming the door shut behind him. But it was too late. The last thing he saw was the twisted, nightmarish grin of the shadow as it closed in on him, and the walls of the apartment seemed to close in around him. And then there was nothing. It had been weeks since anyone had last seen Mark. The building's residents whispered about his sudden disappearance, though none dared to ask questions outright. The maintenance man, Mr. Carter, had been the one to report the strange smell coming from apartment 7B. When the authorities arrived, they found the apartment in a state of eerie disarray. The lights flickered, the walls were damp with an unidentifiable substance, and the air was thick with a suffocating cold. Mark was gone. There was no body, no sign of struggle, only his belongings left untouched, and a diary sitting open on the coffee table. The officers hesitated to touch the diary. Something about it seemed off. The pages appeared weathered and brittle, as though it had been buried for decades, yet the handwriting within was fresh. The entries were fragmented and incoherent, full of desperate ramblings about shadows, whispers, and something watching from the walls. One officer, younger than the rest and trying to mask his nerves, reached out to close the diary. But as his hand hovered over it, the lights in the apartment went out. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it the faintest sound of whispers. They were indistinct at first, just a murmur, but they grew louder, more insistent, until the words became clear: leave or stay forever. One of the officers shone his flashlight around the room, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. But the shadows seemed to shift and move, dancing just out of reach of the light. And then, from the corner of the room, a shape began to emerge. "What the hell is that?" one officer whispered, his voice shaking. The shape grew larger, darker, until it formed the outline of a figure. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural, and wrong. The officers stumbled back, their flashlights flickering as the darkness closed in around them. The last thing they saw before fleeing the apartment was the figure standing in the center of the room, its hollow eyes watching them. And when they finally burst out into the hallway, gasping for air, they found themselves unable to speak of what they had seen. Apartment 7B was sealed off after that. The building's landlord put up a notice, claiming the unit was under renovation, but everyone knew the truth. The whispers could still be heard at night, faint and chilling, seeping through the walls like a dark secret that refused to stay buried. Months later, a new tenant moved in, unaware of the apartment's grim history. They found the diary on the coffee table, its pages blank and waiting. And so the cycle began again. The new tenant, Emma Caldwell, was a graduate student fresh out of options. The rent was cheap, the landlord oddly eager to have her sign the lease, and the neighborhood quiet enough to focus on her studies. She didn't ask questions about the previous tenant, chalking up the low price to sheer luck and the apartment's somewhat decrepit state. When she first entered apartment 7B, she felt a fleeting sense of unease. The air was stale, carrying a metallic tang that clung to her senses. The walls, painted a dull beige, seemed to lean inward ever so slightly, creating a subtle feeling of being watched. But Emma shrugged it off as nothing more than her overactive imagination and exhaustion from the move. Unpacking took longer than expected, and by the time she was done, it was already late. As she set up her small desk in the living room, she noticed the diary sitting on the coffee table. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, and it looked out of place among the sparse furniture. "That's odd," she muttered, picking it up. It didn't belong to her, and she was sure it wasn't there when she'd first entered. She flipped through the pages, finding them blank, save for one near the middle. The handwriting was jagged and uneven. "If you're reading this, it's too late to leave." Emma frowned, feeling an involuntary chill race down her spine. "What kind of prank is this?" she said aloud, setting the diary aside. She went to bed soon after, telling herself it was nothing, a leftover belonging from a previous tenant or a joke left by the landlord. But the first night was restless. At precisely 3:12 a.m., Emma awoke to the sound of scratching. It was faint, but distinct, like fingernails dragging against wood. It seemed to come from the walls, shifting from one side of the room to the other. "Probably rats," she whispered, trying to convince herself. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was deliberate, as if whatever was making the noise wanted her to notice. She buried her head under the pillow and willed herself to sleep. The next morning, she called the landlord to complain. "I think you've got a pest problem," she said. The landlord's voice was strained. "Pests? What kind of pests? Rats, maybe? I heard scratching in the walls all night." There was a long pause. "I'll send someone to look at it," he finally said, his tone clipped and unconvincing. By the third day, the noises grew worse. The scratching turned into tapping, rhythmic and constant, as though someone was signaling from inside the walls. Emma couldn't focus on her studies, the persistent noise driving her to frustration. On the fourth night, she decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight, Emma traced the sound to the living room wall. The tapping stopped abruptly as she approached, and the silence that followed was heavier than she'd expected. She knocked on the wall, hoping to scare off whatever was inside, but the knock was answered. A single, deliberate tap came from the other side. Her breath hitched. "What the?" she whispered, stepping back. The diary, still on the coffee table, seemed to hum faintly in the corner of her vision. She picked it up again, flipping to the same page with the ominous message. This time there was more writing beneath it. "They hear you. Don't talk to them." Emma dropped the diary, her pulse racing. She stared at it, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but the room remained still. Finally, she convinced herself it was a cruel joke and went to bed, though her sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares of shadowy figures emerging from the walls. The following day, things escalated. She returned from class to find her apartment in disarray. Furniture was overturned, books and papers scattered across the floor, and her kitchen cabinets left wide open. But what chilled her the most was the writing on the walls. Scrawled in jagged black letters, it read, "You shouldn't have knocked." Emma's instincts screamed at her to leave, but she was too stubborn, or perhaps too afraid of admitting something was wrong. She called the landlord again, demanding answers. "This isn't normal," she shouted. "Someone broke into my apartment. There's writing on the walls." "I'll send someone," the landlord said again, but this time his voice cracked slightly, betraying an edge of fear. "Do you know what's going on here?" Emma pressed. There was silence on the other end, and then the line went dead. That night, Emma sat in the living room with every light on, clutching the diary like a lifeline. She didn't know why she couldn't throw it away or leave it behind, but something compelled her to keep it close. At 3:12 a.m., the lights began to flicker, and the tapping returned. Emma froze as the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent than before. It seemed to echo from every wall, enveloping her in a cage of sound. Her hands trembled as she clutched the diary, unsure of what to do. She thought about calling someone, anyone, but who would believe her? What would she even say? The tapping stopped suddenly, plunging the apartment into an oppressive silence. Emma held her breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of her own heartbeat. Then, from the far corner of the living room, she heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. "Emma!" She jolted upright, her eyes darting to the corner. Nothing. The shadows danced as the flickering light bulb struggled to stay lit. "Emma!" This time it was louder, more distinct, as if the voice were right behind her. She spun around, but again there was no one there. The whispering stopped, replaced by the sound of something scraping across the hardwood floor. Emma's gaze dropped to the diary. Its cover was slightly ajar, as though the book had shifted on its own. With a deep, shuddering breath, she opened it to the marked page. The writing had changed again. "Don't look in the corner." Her head snapped toward the corner before she could stop herself. At first, there was nothing unusual, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw it, a faint, human-shaped outline darker than the surrounding shadows. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply stood there, watching her. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed, caught in the thing's invisible grip. The outline began to shift, its edges bleeding into the surrounding darkness as it stepped closer. "No," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay away." The figure paused, tilting its head in a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. Then it stretched one long, spindly arm toward her. Emma bolted, her survival instincts finally kicking in. She sprinted for the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving as she tried to calm herself. The tapping resumed, now coming from the other side of the door. "No, no, no," she muttered, backing away. She grabbed her phone from the bedside table and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. A voice came through the static instead. "Emma, you can't escape." She dropped the phone as a loud thud shook the door. The sound of splintering would fill the room, and she knew the door wouldn't hold for long. Desperate, she searched for something, anything, she could use to defend herself. Her eyes landed on the diary, sitting ominously on her dresser. With no other options, she grabbed it and flipped to the next page, hoping for some clue, some instruction. The page was blank at first, but words began to scrawl themselves across the paper in real time. The closet. Hide in the closet. Emma hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to trap herself, but another thud shook the door, and she knew she was out of time. She threw open the closet door and slipped inside, shutting it behind her just as the bedroom door gave way. Through the slats of the closet door, she saw the shadowy figure enter the room. It moved with unnatural jerks, its limbs bending in ways that made her stomach churn. It stopped in the center of the room, tilting its head as if listening. Emma pressed herself deeper into the corner of the closet, her breaths shallow and quiet. The figure began to search, its long, claw-like fingers tracing the edges of the furniture. The diary vibrated in her hands, and she glanced down to see more words forming on the page. Don't let it find you. Stay silent. She clamped a hand over her mouth as the figure's movements grew more frantic. It overturned the bed, ripped drawers from the dresser, and flung the lamp across the room. The light bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. The figure stopped. Its head turned slowly toward the closet. Emma's heart pounded as it approached, its steps slow and deliberate. She gripped the diary tightly, tears streaming down her face as she silently prayed for it to go away. It stopped in front of the closet. Emma, the voice rasped, more insistent this time. The figure raised one clawed hand and dragged it down the closet door, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the inevitable. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. When she opened her eyes, the figure was gone. The room was silent again, save for her ragged breathing. She stayed in the closet for what felt like hours, afraid to move. Finally, when the first light of dawn crept through the window, Emma emerged. The apartment was a wreck, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. She looked down at the diary in her hands, hoping for an explanation, but the pages were blank once more. For the first time since moving in, Emma seriously considered leaving. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was in apartment 7B wasn't going to let her go. As the sun rose higher, its light creeping further into the shattered remains of her apartment, Emma found herself pacing the wreckage, clutching the diary. She couldn't bring herself to put it down, as though letting go of it would unleash something worse. Every creak of the floor beneath her feet made her jump, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. She tried calling the landlord again, this time using a neighbor's phone, but the line disconnected after a single ring. No voicemail, no response. Frustrated and terrified, she decided to leave the building altogether, even if it was just for a few hours. She needed air, a break from the oppressive weight of the apartment's eerie silence. Emma packed a small bag with essentials, including the diary. She didn't trust it enough to leave it behind. She stepped into the hallway, the familiar hum of the old building's fluorescent lights suddenly comforting. It made her feel less alone, but the comfort didn't last. As she made her way toward the elevator, she noticed her neighbor's doors. Every single one was slightly ajar. Shadows danced within the dim interiors, though no sound came from inside. Emma paused, a shiver running down her spine. "Hello," she called hesitantly. Her voice echoed unnaturally down the hallway. No response. She approached the elevator, pressing the call button repeatedly until it finally dinged. The doors opened with a groan, revealing an empty car. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. her reflection in the mirrored walls looking pale and haunted. The ride down was painfully slow, each floor ticking by with an audible chime. On the fourth floor, the elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing a pitch-black hallway. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she peered out. The lights on this floor were completely out, the darkness impenetrable. She strained her ears, trying to detect any movement, but the only sound was the faint hum of the elevator. "Don't step out," a voice whispered. Emma froze. It wasn't her imagination, the voice was real. It was faint but clear, coming from directly behind her. She spun around, but the elevator was empty. The doors began to close, but before they could shut completely, a hand darted through the gap, stopping them. Emma stumbled back as the doors slid open again, revealing a figure standing in the hallway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face partially obscured by shadows. His eyes glinted unnaturally as he stared at her. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said, his voice low and guttural. Emma shook her head, backing into the corner of the elevator. "What are you talking about?" "The diary," he said, stepping into the elevator. The doors closed behind him with a metallic clang. She gripped the diary tighter, her back pressed against the mirrored wall. "Who are you? How do you know about this?" "I was like you once," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "Curious. Stupid. I thought I could handle it, but now," he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the diary in her hands. "Now it won't let me leave." Emma's mind raced. "What do you mean? What is this thing?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the emergency stop button, slamming his hand against it. The elevator jerked to a halt between floors, the overhead lights flickering. "What are you doing?" Emma shouted, panic rising in her chest. "You need to destroy it," he said, his tone urgent. "It's the only way to break the cycle. Burn it, bury it, throw it in the ocean, anything to get rid of it. If you don't," he trailed off, his eyes darkening. Emma looked down at the diary, its worn cover now feeling like it weighed a ton. "Why can't you do it?" The man's expression twisted with fear. "I tried. It won't let me. But maybe you still have a chance." Before Emma could respond, the elevator lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. She felt the air grow colder, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight. And then she heard it, the tapping. It started faintly, a soft, rhythmic sound echoing in the confined space. "It's here," the man whispered. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from every direction. Emma clutched the diary, her heart racing. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer. When the lights flickered back on, he was gone. Emma was alone in the elevator, the diary trembling in her hands. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. She pressed the lobby button again, desperate to escape, but the elevator didn't move. The only thing she could do was wait, and hope that whatever was coming wouldn't find her first. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she leaned against the mirrored wall of the elevator. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and trembling, clutching the diary as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. The man's words echoed in her mind. "You need to destroy it. Burn it, bury it, throw it in the ocean." The elevator finally jerked back to life, its groaning mechanics pulling her downward. Emma's hands tightened around the diary, her pulse thundering in her ears. She kept her eyes fixed on the glowing panel of floor numbers, willing the descent to end. The lobby. Just get to the lobby. With a ding, the elevator came to a halt, and the doors slid open. Emma stepped out cautiously, her sneakers scuffing against the marble floor. The lobby was eerily quiet, the normally bustling space empty. The air felt thick, heavy, like it carried an unseen weight. She hurried toward the glass doors, only to find them locked. She tugged at the handles, but they didn't budge. A faint whispering sound caught her attention, and she turned to see a shadow flicker across the wall. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The whispering grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices, indistinct but urgent. They seemed to be coming from the diary. Emma hesitated, then slowly opened the book. The pages were blank. Her stomach dropped. She flipped through frantically, searching for the ominous entries that had tormented her. They were gone, the paper yellowed and empty, as if the words had never existed. A guttural growl rose from behind her. Emma whirled around, her back pressed against the glass doors. The shadows in the room coalesced, twisting and writhing until they formed a humanoid figure. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow orbs that burned with malice. "You brought it here," the figure rasped, its voice a chilling blend of anger and anguish. Emma's legs nearly gave out beneath her. "Brought what? I don't understand." "The curse," it growled, stepping closer. Its form shifted with every movement, like smoke trapped in a storm. "It feeds on you now." Her grip on the diary tightened as the figure loomed over her. In a desperate act, she raised it between them like a shield. The entity recoiled slightly, its glow dimming. "It's the book," Emma whispered, realization dawning on her. "You're tied to the book." The figure hissed, its shape flickering violently. "Destroy it," it commanded, the same words the man in the elevator had said. "Free me. Free yourself." "But how?" she cried, her voice cracking. "Fire," it rasped, retreating slightly. "Only fire can purge its hold." Emma didn't need to be told twice. She bolted for the front desk, her hands fumbling through drawers and cabinets until she found a box of matches. Her heart hammered as she looked for something flammable. There was an artificial plant near the entrance. She grabbed it, stuffing the diary into its plastic leaves. She struck a match, her hands trembling so violently that the flame nearly went out. The shadow loomed closer, its form stretching across the walls. Emma lit the plant, the fire catching the diary within moments. As the flames consumed the book, the shadow let out an ear-splitting wail, its form disintegrating into wisps of smoke. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest, until it all released in a sudden, deafening silence. Emma collapsed to her knees, coughing and gasping for air. The diary was reduced to ashes, the charred remains scattered across the marble floor. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the lobby feeling lighter, almost normal. She sat there for a long moment, her body shaking from adrenaline. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced, and the glass doors unlocked with a soft click. Emma stood unsteadily, brushing ash off her hands. She stepped outside into the crisp night air, breathing deeply for the first time in what felt like hours. The world felt brighter, freer, as though a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying had finally been lifted. But as she walked away, her shadow stretched unnaturally long under the streetlights, and faint whispers followed her into the night. Emma didn't dare look back. The whispers were faint, so faint she could convince herself they were nothing more than the wind threading through the city. But her every step was accompanied by a prickle at the back of her neck, a sensation of being watched. She made it home just as dawn broke. The first rays of sunlight painted her apartment in gold, chasing away the remnants of the nightmare she'd endured. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, sliding down to sit on the floor. Her hands trembled as she pressed her palms against her face, trying to steady her breathing. "It's over," she whispered aloud, as if saying the words might make them true. "It's over." The day passed in a blur. Emma avoided her bedroom, where the diary had first appeared, choosing instead to sit on the couch with the TV on, the volume low. She kept the curtains wide open, letting the sunlight pour in. She told herself it was a precaution, just in case the shadows tried to return. By evening, exhaustion claimed her. She dozed off on the couch, her head resting against the armrest, the soft hum of the television lulling her to sleep. When she woke, it was dark. Her heart sank. She hadn't turned the lights on before falling asleep. The apartment was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the TV screen, which now displayed static. Emma sat up, her pulse quickening as she fumbled for her phone. The screen lit up, illuminating the room, and she sighed in relief. She checked the time, 3:12 a.m. The whispers started again. Her body froze. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A soft chorus of voices layered over one another, weaving a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, it's gone. I burned it. It's gone." A creak sounded from the hallway leading to her bedroom. The noise shattered her fragile sense of safety, and she leapt to her feet, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The only answer was another creak, louder this time, closer. She stepped backward, her heel bumping against the coffee table. She turned on the flashlight on her phone and aimed it toward the hallway. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The whispers grew louder. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she edged toward the door. Her mind raced with every possibility. Had she missed something? Was there more to the curse than the diary? Or had burning it simply unleashed whatever was bound to its pages? The whispers rose to a cacophony. Shadows rippled along the walls, twisting and contorting, forming shapes that danced just beyond the reach of her flashlight. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, though her quivering voice betrayed her. The shadows stilled for a moment, then surged forward. Emma screamed and stumbled back, her phone slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The light from the flashlight spun wildly, casting dizzying patterns on the walls. A cold hand gripped her ankle. Emma kicked frantically, her foot connecting with something solid but yielding. The grip loosened, and she scrambled toward the door, yanking it open and bolting into the hallway. The building was silent, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. Emma didn't stop. She ran for the stairs, not daring to wait for the elevator. Her bare feet slapped against the cold concrete steps as she descended, her breathing ragged and her heart hammering in her chest. She burst out onto the street, the cool night air shocking her lungs. She didn't stop running until she reached a nearby park, collapsing onto a bench beneath the glow of a street lamp. Emma sat there, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, rocking back and forth as she tried to calm down. The whispers were gone, the shadows nowhere to be seen. But the sense of unease lingered. In the dim light of the street lamp, Emma noticed a dark smear on her ankle where the hand had grabbed her. She wiped at it, only for the mark to spread, as though it were sinking into her skin. Her stomach churned as a thought struck her. The diary might have been destroyed, but whatever it had contained was still here. It was in her now. The whispers returned, soft and insidious, their source no longer external. Emma stared blankly ahead, her body trembling as tears slid down her cheeks. And somewhere deep inside her mind, a voice not her own whispered, "You'll never be alone again." The voice was not like the whispers. It was distinct, clear, deliberate, and terrifyingly intimate. It didn't echo as the whispers did. It resided within her, a parasite latched onto the deepest parts of her mind. Emma clutched her head, rocking on the park bench under the unrelenting gaze of the street lamp. She tried to push the voice out, to silence it with her own thoughts. But every time she tried, it only grew louder, like a dark tide swelling to drown her. "You're not real," she muttered, her voice cracking. "You're not real. I'm as real as you let me be," the voice cooed. It sounded calm, almost amused. You read my story. You invited me in. No, Emma said, shaking her head violently. No, I didn't. I didn't know. The voice chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down her spine. Does it matter now? You gave me what I needed, a vessel. You're mine now, Emma. Her name spoken in that voice was unbearable. It felt as though it stripped her identity away, reducing her to nothing more than a hollow shell. Emma leapt to her feet, pacing in frantic circles under the street lamp. She clawed at her arms, her skin crawling with an invisible presence she couldn't shake. What do you want? She screamed into the empty night. What do you want from me? To live, it whispered, its tone soft but resolute. To grow. To become. Emma stumbled backward, her knees giving out as she collapsed onto the grass. Her hands dug into the earth, as though grounding herself could free her from the thing inside her. But even as she clenched the soil, the whispers started again. They weren't external now. They came from within her, vibrating through her chest, her skull, her very being. The voice grew louder, overlapping with itself, creating a cacophony that filled her head. She slammed her fists against her temples, desperate to drown it out. Stop it! Get out of my head! I can't, it said simply. You are me now, and I am you. There is no separation. She screamed, the sound raw and animalistic, tearing through the stillness of the night. Lights flicked on in the surrounding apartment buildings as curious neighbors peeked out of their windows, but Emma couldn't stop. She screamed until her throat felt shredded, until the whispers inside her became an unbearable roar. And then abruptly there was silence. Emma blinked, her breath hitching as she looked around. The park was quiet. The street lamp buzzed faintly above her. Her body trembled as she got to her feet, her mind swimming in a sea of confusion and fear. Had it gone? Was it over? She took a tentative step forward, then another, her hands clutching her arms. She felt hollow, like an echo of herself. Her footsteps were unsteady as she made her way back toward her building, her body moving on autopilot. She didn't know what else to do. When she reached her apartment, the door was slightly ajar. Her stomach sank, but she forced herself to push it open. The room was dark, the air heavy with an almost tangible presence. Her flashlight was still on the floor, the beam casting strange, twisting shadows on the walls. Emma stepped inside, her breath shallow as she closed the door behind her. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. She felt as though she were being watched, every movement scrutinized by unseen eyes. And then she saw it. In the center of the living room, where the diary had once lain, there was something else now, a mirror. Its surface gleamed, pristine and inviting. Emma's reflection stared back at her, but something about it was wrong. Her reflection wasn't trembling like she was. It wasn't clutching its arms or darting its eyes around the room. It was smiling. The voice spoke again, soft and triumphant. Welcome home, Emma. Her reflection raised a hand and waved, and Emma's world went dark. When Emma woke up, she was lying on the cold, hard floor of her apartment. Her head throbbed, and her limbs felt heavy, as though an invisible weight pressed down on her. The room was dimly lit, the early morning sun casting pale streaks of light through the curtains. For a brief moment, she wondered if it had all been a nightmare. The diary, the voice, the reflection in the mirror. But as she shifted her head, she saw the mirror was still there, standing in the center of the room, its surface gleaming unnaturally in the muted light. Emma sat up slowly, every movement cautious, her heart pounding in her chest. Her reflection stared back at her, perfectly mirroring her actions. There was no smile this time, no eerie wave. Just her, pale and frightened, her wide eyes filled with dread. Okay, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. I can figure this out. I just need to. Before she could finish her thought, the reflection moved, just slightly, but enough to freeze her mid-sentence. It tilted its head to the side, studying her. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her reflection smiled once more, its expression chillingly serene. "Who are you?" Emma demanded, her voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass as though trying to breach the barrier between them. Emma scrambled backward, her back hitting the wall. She felt her breath quicken, panic clawing at her throat. The voice returned, whispering from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Don't you understand? I am you now, and you are me. We're the same, Emma." "No, we're not," she screamed. "You're not me. You're something else." The reflection's smile widened, its head tilting further. "Deny it all you want. But the more you fight, the stronger I become." Emma shook her head, her hands covering her ears as though she could block out the voice. "Get out of my head," she shouted. "Get out of my life." The reflection chuckled, the sound vibrating through the room like a low hum. The mirror began to ripple, its surface shimmering like water. Emma watched in horror as the reflection stepped forward, its form pressing against the glass. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, no, no." The figure stepped out of the mirror, its movements fluid and otherworldly. It stood before her now, a perfect copy of herself, but with an air of unnatural stillness. Its eyes were dark, endless voids that seemed to absorb the light around them. "You can't be real," Emma stammered. "This can't be happening." The doppelganger knelt before her, its expression soft and pitying. "It's very real, Emma," it said, its voice identical to hers but layered with an unsettling undertone. "And you have a choice to make." Emma stared at it, her chest heaving. What choice?" The doppelganger extended a hand, its fingers long and pale. "Join me. Embrace what you've become." Or, its smile faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. "Be consumed." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she shook her head. "I don't understand. I don't understand any of this." "You don't need to understand," the doppelganger said, its voice soft but unyielding. "You just need to accept." Emma looked at the outstretched hand, her mind racing. She couldn't trust it. She couldn't give in. But as the whispers began to rise again, louder and more insistent, she realized she was running out of time. "Choose, Emma," the doppelganger said, its dark eyes narrowing. "Before the choice is made for you." Her body trembled, her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted to fight, to resist, but the weight of the whispers, the voice, and the figure before her felt insurmountable. As the doppelganger's hand reached closer, Emma took a deep, shuddering breath and closed her eyes tightly, refusing to take the doppelganger's hand. The whispers surged around her, growing louder and angrier, like a chorus of disapproval. Emma felt as though the weight of the world was crushing her chest, and yet she clung to her resolve. "No," she whispered through gritted teeth. "I won't let you take me." The doppelganger's face twisted into an expression of frustration, its serene demeanor cracking. "You think you have a choice, Emma? You think you can resist what's already begun?" Emma forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. "Maybe I can't stop it, but I'm not going to just give up. You're not me, and you'll never be me." The figure tilted its head, studying her as if she were a puzzle it couldn't quite solve. "Defiance," it said, almost amused. "It's quaint, but ultimately futile." The whispers began to swirl around Emma like a cyclone, the room growing colder with every passing second. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the doppelganger seemed to grow larger, its shadow stretching across the walls like an ominous stain. But then something caught Emma's attention, a faint glow emanating from the diary, which had been lying forgotten on the floor. It pulsed with a soft, golden light, contrasting starkly against the oppressive darkness surrounding her. Emma didn't hesitate. She lunged for the diary, her fingers closing around its worn leather cover. The moment she touched it, the whispers faltered, their intensity dimming as though they were being muffled. The doppelganger recoiled slightly, its expression shifting to one of surprise and fear. "What are you doing?" it hissed, its voice laced with venom. Emma opened the diary, flipping through the pages. The golden light grew brighter, illuminating words she hadn't noticed before. They seemed to shimmer on the page, written in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The words came to her lips unbidden, a chant that felt ancient and powerful. Illuminare anima obscura, exilium tenebris, red quod non tuum est. The doppelganger screamed, a sound that was both human and inhuman. Its form began to flicker, shifting between Emma's likeness and something grotesque, a shadowy, twisted entity that defied comprehension. "No," it shrieked. "You don't know what you're doing. Stop." But Emma didn't stop. She repeated the chant, her voice growing stronger with each word. The golden light enveloped her, filling the room with a warmth that pushed back the shadows. The doppelganger writhed, its form collapsing in on itself as though it were being torn apart. With a final, ear-piercing scream, the entity dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like a storm breaking. Emma collapsed to her knees, clutching the diary to her chest. Tears streamed down her face as relief washed over her. She glanced at the mirror, which now reflected only her, a tired, shaken, but undeniably human version of herself. The surface of the mirror cracked, spiderwebbing outward until it shattered entirely, the pieces falling to the floor in a glittering cascade. Emma sat there for a long time, the diary still glowing faintly in her hands. She knew she couldn't stay in the apartment. Whatever had happened here, whatever had tried to claim her, was beyond her understanding. But she had survived, and that was enough for now. As she stood and gathered her things, she noticed one last thing in the diary. A new entry, written in her own handwriting, but with words she didn't remember writing. "You've won this time, Emma, but the darkness is patient, and it never truly leaves." Shivering, Emma closed the diary and placed it in her bag. She left the apartment without looking back, stepping into the sunlight as if emerging from a long, harrowing dream. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some shadowed corner, the darkness was watching and waiting. As Emma made her way down the stairwell of the apartment building, she could feel the weight of the darkness still lingering, like a shadow that clung to her every step. The sunlight outside was bright, almost blinding, and yet it did nothing to chase away the gnawing feeling in her stomach. She reached the front door of the building and pushed it open, stepping into the bright, bustling world outside. People moved past her in a blur, laughing, talking, and going about their day. But to Emma it all felt distant, hollow, as though she were watching life from behind a veil. Her hand instinctively clutched the bag that held the diary. She knew she couldn't just leave it behind. It was the key to everything. But there was no ignoring the nagging feeling that whatever had been in that apartment, whatever had been watching her, hadn't truly been vanquished. The street outside felt too open, too exposed. Emma's eyes darted to every shadow, every corner. She could have sworn she saw movement from the corner of her eye, figures lurking in alleyways, faces peering at her from windows. But when she turned, they were gone. Shaking her head, Emma quickened her pace. She had to get away, get far away. But no matter how fast she walked, the unease wouldn't leave. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was too strong. The darkness that had followed her through the apartment still clung to her, like an invisible hand on her shoulder. When she reached her car, Emma hesitated before opening the door. She turned back to the building, her gaze lingering on the windows of apartment 7B. The building seemed so ordinary, so peaceful, yet it held something in its bones, something ancient and malevolent that was still, in some way, part of her. Suddenly, she felt a cold breeze brush against her neck. A whisper, soft and barely audible, drifted through the air. "Emma!" She froze. The voice was too familiar, too much like her own. It came from nowhere, and yet it was everywhere. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but there was no one there. The street was empty, the windows of the building dark and still. But Emma knew. She knew. The darkness hadn't been defeated. It had only been pushed back, for now. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the diary, and she made a decision. She couldn't run from it. She couldn't escape it. Whatever it was that had been haunting her, it had already become part of her life. But that didn't mean she had to face it alone. With a deep breath, Emma opened the car door and slipped inside, the diary safe in her lap. She knew she would have to confront whatever was following her, whether it be in the shadows of the past or the dark recesses of her own mind. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Emma's grip tightened on the wheel as she drove, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt almost soothing against the rising panic in her chest. Her mind raced with everything she had learned from the diary, the chilling events, the dark force that seemed to linger in every crevice of apartment 7B. She had tried to leave it behind, to sever the connection, but it had followed her, as if the very walls of the building had been designed to trap her. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the back seat, something that wasn't there before. But all she saw was the empty road behind her. Still, the sense of dread grew, like an invisible weight pressing against her chest. The world outside seemed normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers in her ear, the cold breath against her neck, it wasn't just in her head. Something was real. Something had been left behind when she left that apartment. She thought about the strange, shadowy figures in the diary, the unearthly presence that had followed its previous occupants. Now it seemed like the same presence was hunting her. The road seemed endless, the night stretching out before her like a darkened chasm. She couldn't stop now, not until she figured out what was going on. After what felt like an eternity, Emma turned onto a quieter street. The houses here were older, more isolated, tucked away from the rest of the town. She parked in front of one such house, its dark windows staring back at her. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest. She had to find answers. There was no way she was going back to apartment 7B, not without a better understanding of what had happened there, what had been lurking inside the walls, inside the diary. With the diary still in her hands, she stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. The front door was cracked open, as though inviting her inside. The house had a strange, musty smell to it, like old wood and damp earth. It was colder than the night outside, and the air was thick with something unspoken. Emma's instincts told her to turn back, but she pressed on. She had to know. Inside, the house was dark, save for the faint moonlight streaming through the cracked windows. The walls were lined with old portraits, faded, yellowed faces that seemed to watch her as she moved through the rooms. Each step felt like a violation of the house's slumber, as though her very presence was disturbing something that had been resting undisturbed for years. She opened the door to a study at the back of the house. The room was cluttered with dusty old books and papers scattered across a wooden desk. At the far wall was a large, ornate mirror, its glass cracked, the reflection warped and unsettling. She hesitated for a moment, but then she stepped forward, determined to find whatever she had been searching for. Her eyes scanned the papers on the desk, but nothing seemed to stand out. She pushed them aside, moving toward a large, old-fashioned wardrobe that stood against the far wall. The wood creaked ominously as she opened the doors. Inside, there was nothing but empty shelves and an old, faded blanket tucked into the back corner. But something caught her eye. Behind the blanket, a small, hidden compartment in the wall beckoned her. It was barely noticeable, almost as if it had been purposefully concealed. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She pulled at the loose panel, and with a groan it slid open. Inside there was a small box, no bigger than a shoebox. It was covered in strange markings, symbols she recognized from the diary. The air around her seemed to thicken as she lifted the box from its hiding place, her fingers trembling as she traced the symbols carved into its surface. This was it, the last piece. She opened the box slowly, almost reverently. Inside was a collection of photographs, old and worn, their edges curling with age. Most of the images were of people, some of whom she recognized, others she did not. But there was one photo that stood out among the rest. It was a picture of a man standing in front of the very house she was standing in now. He was smiling, but there was something off about the expression on his face, something unnatural. In the background, she could see the reflection of something, someone, hidden in the shadows. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. As she looked at the photograph, she could almost feel the presence of someone, or something, watching her just behind her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and the lights flickered. Emma spun around, but the room was still empty. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe in the corners of the room. The whispers began again. This time they were louder, clearer. The voice, familiar, yet distant, called her name. Emma! Her heart raced. She had seen the warning signs in the diary, heard the stories of those who had lived in this house before her. The entity had followed them. It had followed her, and now it was here. Emma's breath quickened as the whispers grew louder, their rhythm matching the rapid thudding of her heart. She turned toward the door, but it was already too late. The shadows, which had once clung to the edges of the room, were now inching forward, creeping toward her like something alive. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. The temperature dropped sharply, her skin prickling with the sudden chill. She could hear the rustling of something just beyond her line of sight. She took a step backward, then another, her eyes flicking between the photo in her hands and the door. She needed to leave. She needed to escape. But the door, it was no longer where it had been. It seemed farther away now, as if the room itself was shifting, stretching, warping. The whispers became more distinct, and Emma could almost make out words between the voices. Leave now. The sound came from behind her, and before she could react, a sharp, icy gust of wind swept past her, extinguishing the candle she had brought with her. The room plunged into complete darkness. Emma's breathing hitched as she fumbled for her phone in her pocket, but it was dead. The battery had been full when she left the car. There was no way. A heavy thud echoed through the room, followed by dragging footsteps. Emma froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. She strained her eyes, trying to make out any movement in the pitch-black room, but it was impossible. The darkness had become thick, suffocating, as if the shadows themselves were closing in around her. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. Then, through the overwhelming silence, a low, guttural laugh broke the stillness. It came from behind her. Emma's blood ran cold. She didn't dare turn around, but she could feel something, someone, just inches away. A presence that wasn't human. It was something old, something ancient. Suddenly, the cold air was replaced by a rancid, decaying stench like rotting wood and earth. Emma gagged, but she couldn't move. Her limbs felt heavy, as though they were being weighed down by an invisible force. The laughter continued, taunting her, echoing around the room. "Leave or join us." The voice, distinct now, was low and rasping, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. Emma's body was frozen in place, terror coursing through her veins, but something deep inside her told her she couldn't stay. She had to leave. She had to run. Her legs were numb, but she forced herself to move, one step after another, each one slower than the last, the shadows growing thicker with each movement. The room stretched, elongating into an endless abyss as the door seemed to move farther and farther away. The darkness was suffocating, and her own breath sounded foreign to her ears, muffled as if underwater. Then, a loud crash sounded from the corner of the room, followed by a guttural growl. Emma turned instinctively toward the noise, her heart skipping a beat. Through the veil of shadows, she saw it. The figure, the thing, was emerging from the darkness. A silhouette of twisted limbs and contorted features, moving like liquid shadows, its form shifting and pulsing in the air. The thing's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, hollow and empty, yet filled with an unfathomable hunger. It was watching her. Emma's legs finally responded, the terror propelling her forward. She stumbled, but kept moving, feeling the distance between her and the door closing with every second. She could hear the footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. The thing was getting closer. With a final, desperate push, she reached the door, her hand slamming against the handle. But it wouldn't open. Her heart sank as she pulled at the door again and again, but it refused to budge. The whispers grew louder, frantic now, urging her to leave, to run. But where? There was nowhere to go. The creature's breath, foul and putrid, was hot on her neck now. She could feel its presence just behind her, the darkness surrounding her like a suffocating cloud. She was trapped. Just as Emma's mind began to fray, the room around her seemed to tremble. The walls cracked, splitting open as a blinding white light flooded the space. It was as if the house itself was fighting back, rejecting the thing that had taken hold. The creature screamed, a horrifying screech that echoed through the entire house. Its form flickered, shifting violently, before it collapsed into nothingness, leaving only the deafening silence in its wake. Emma stood frozen, her body trembling, her mind reeling. The room was still eerily calm. The shadows that had chased her were gone, replaced by the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the cracked windows. She didn't dare move. She didn't know if the thing was gone for good, or if it was just waiting, biding its time. In the distance, she heard a door creak open, then another, and another. As the oppressive silence lifted, the house seemed to come alive, its creaks and groans filling the air. Emma slowly turned, her eyes darting around the room. The photo she had found earlier, the one with the smiling man, now sat in front of her on the desk, its edges warped and curling. Something had changed. Something had shifted. With shaking hands, Emma backed away, her feet moving on their own as she exited the study. She had to leave. She had to get out. The house might have rejected the creature, but it wasn't free from the past. Not yet. As she stumbled toward the door, she could hear the whispers again. Faint, distant. And then a voice, one she hadn't heard before, but one that sounded eerily familiar. "You can't escape, Emma." The door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness once again. And then nothing. The air grew thick again as Emma stood in the dark hallway. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath shallow, struggling to break through the suffocating silence. The house felt alive now, breathing, shifting, reacting to her every move. It felt as though the walls were closing in on her, pressing tighter, making it harder to think. She stumbled back, her eyes flicking to the stairway that led down to the front door. If she could make it there, she could escape. But every step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was pulling her back. The whispers returned, more urgent this time, echoing in her ears, no longer distant but right beside her, as if they were inside her very mind. Emma clenched her fists, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. They filled the entire space, invading her thoughts, drowning out everything else. The voice from earlier, a soft, familiar whisper, came again, but this time it was clearer. "You can't escape, Emma. You're already one of us." Her breath caught in her throat. The words, "one of us," sent chills down her spine. She turned toward the voice, her eyes wide, but there was nothing in the dark hall except shadows. No figure, no form, just the oppressive darkness surrounding her. Something moved in the shadows. A slight shift, barely perceptible, but it was there. Emma's pulse quickened as her eyes darted around the room, desperate to find the source. But again, nothing. The shadows danced, warping into unnatural shapes, but they didn't take form. She had to move. She couldn't stay here. She wasn't safe. She took a step back, but the floor beneath her feet seemed to groan in protest. The house seemed to shift once more, the walls flexing as if alive, threatening to swallow her whole. She could feel the pulse of the house, its heartbeat reverberating through the floor, vibrating in her bones. The house was rejecting her, but it wasn't going to let her leave without a fight. Her eyes snapped to the staircase. The front door was so close, but the house wouldn't let her go. She was trapped in its grasp. She bolted forward, desperate to make it to the door. Each step felt like a mile, but she pushed on, her legs burning with effort. The whispers grew louder, like a crescendo, like they were pushing her forward. Emma reached the door, grabbing for the handle, but as her fingers touched it, the door violently slammed shut. The force knocked her backward, sending her sprawling onto the floor. Her head collided with the wooden floor, her vision blurred for a moment. She gasped for breath, disoriented and dazed, but then the whispers turned to a roar. The walls trembled, the floor shifting as if the house itself was breathing, groaning, and the shadows stretched toward her. They were no longer mere silhouettes, but reaching hands, long, twisting fingers that crept across the floor, slowly making their way toward her. Emma scrambled to her feet, her pulse hammering in her ears. She grabbed the door handle again, yanking at it with everything she had, but it wouldn't budge. The thing in the house, whatever it was, wasn't letting her leave. It was playing with her. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, briefly illuminating the hallway, but they did nothing to dispel the terror that gripped her heart. In that brief moment of clarity, she saw the truth. The walls were alive with something terrible, something ancient that had waited too long. The flickering lights revealed grotesque, twisted shapes, faces, hands, and figures that seemed to have emerged from the very foundation of the house. And then, in the center of the hallway, a figure appeared. It was like a man, but not. It had the shape of a person, but its features were distorted. Its limbs unnaturally long, its skin a sickly, grayish hue, its face devoid of expression, a hollow, empty void where eyes should have been. It stood in the doorway, blocking her only escape. Emma's breath hitched in her chest, and she froze. The creature did not move, but its presence seemed to fill the entire house, making everything feel oppressive, suffocating. "You shouldn't have come." The creature's voice was a low, gravelly growl, seeping into her thoughts, chilling her to the core. "This house is ours, and now you belong to us." Emma's body trembled, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The creature reached out, its fingers twisting toward her like claws, but before they could touch her, a loud crack echoed through the house. The walls shuddered, groaning in agony as though they were breaking apart. Then all at once, the pressure in the room seemed to lift. The shadows receded, the whispers faded, and the figure in the hallway vanished into thin air. The room was silent, deathly silent. The air was still, and Emma was alone. She stood there, her heart racing, her body numb with fear. It had stopped. But why? What had happened? With trembling hands, Emma grabbed the door handle one last time. She yanked, and this time it opened. The outside world greeted her with its cold air, the night sky dark and endless above her. She didn't look back. As she ran, the echoes of the whispers followed her. In her mind, she could still hear them. They were calling her name. They were calling her home. But Emma wouldn't answer. Not anymore. She ran through the night, her footsteps echoing on the pavement, until the house was far behind her, far enough to pretend that she was free. But the shadows followed her, no matter how far she ran. The night air felt like a cold, wet cloth against her skin, but Emma couldn't stop. Her legs burned, her chest heaved with the exertion, but she didn't dare slow down. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to keep going until she couldn't hear the whispers anymore, until the weight of the house was no longer on her shoulders. But as she rounded a corner, she slowed. The sound of her breath, the pounding of her heart, was drowned out by something else. A faint hum, like the sound of an electric current, flickering in and out, growing louder with each passing second. She glanced around, but the street was empty. There were no cars, no people, just the dark alleyway stretching before her. The hum was coming from behind her, from the direction of the apartment building. Emma's stomach twisted into a knot. She forced herself to look, and her breath caught in her throat. There, standing at the end of the street, was the building. The apartment building. The lights were on. The whole building. Every window illuminated, even the ones in the floors above the one she had been staying in. But it was impossible. She had left. She had run. There was no way it should be on. Then, from one of the windows on the top floor, she saw a shadow move. Just for a moment, the shape of something, or someone, crossed the window, then disappeared. Her legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop herself from walking toward the building. Step by step, she moved closer. The hum grew louder, and now she could hear something else. A low murmur, like a chant, coming from within the walls of the building. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to slip inside. She didn't want to go back. She couldn't, but something pulled her toward it. Some invisible force that she couldn't explain. She stepped inside. The air inside was colder than outside. The familiar smell of the building was there, musty, stale, as if it hadn't been properly aired in years. The stairs creaked under her weight, the silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. When she reached the hallway, the lights flickered again, and she saw them, figures standing in the doorway of her apartment, staring at her. Faces, twisted, distorted, but somehow familiar. They looked like the people she had seen before, in the house, in the walls. But their eyes were empty, lifeless, like they were waiting for her to join them. But Emma couldn't. She wouldn't. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, panicking. The door wouldn't budge. The figures in the doorway stepped forward, their faces twisted in silent screams, reaching toward her with arms that elongated into grotesque shapes. The shadows that had once been the house now filled the hallway, stretching long and thin, crawling toward her like a sea of darkness. The hum grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out every thought, every scream. Emma backed into the wall, trying to find an escape, but there was no way out. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, the shadows closing in from all sides. Then a voice, so soft, so quiet, but piercing through the chaos, whispered her name. Emma! She froze. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source, but there was no one. Emma, you should have stayed. You were meant to stay. The voice echoed through the hallway, and Emma's heart sank. It was the voice from before, the one in the apartment, in the walls. But it was different now. It was colder, more sinister. She tried to scream, but her throat closed up, her words trapped inside her chest. The darkness reached for her, its tendrils creeping along the floor, up the walls, covering every surface. It was everywhere. She couldn't escape it, and then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, emerging from the shadows, was the figure, the one she had seen before. The same twisted, disfigured shape, its face hollow and blackened, eyes empty and unblinking. It was taller now, its limbs stretched impossibly long. It stepped forward, its form shifting with every movement, and in its hands it held something. A diary. Her heart stopped. No, not again. The figure held the diary, the same diary that had been left behind by the previous tenant. The one that had started all of this. The one that had warned her. The one she had tried to forget. It opened the diary, its fingers turning the pages. The pages were yellowed, brittle, but there was something on them. Words, symbols, unfamiliar but terrifyingly clear. They were the same words she had seen before, the same phrases that had haunted her dreams. "You're here," the figure said, its voice cold and raspy. "And now you will stay." The shadows closed in. The walls groaned. Emma's vision blurred, and in that instant, she realized the truth. It was never just the house. It was the people before her, the ones who had lived there and the ones who had left. And now she was one of them, forever. Emma felt herself being pulled, a force stronger than anything she could resist. She stumbled backward, her hands pressed against the wall, as the shadowy figure came closer, holding the diary like a grotesque invitation. The air around her thickened, growing heavier with every second. The walls, once familiar, felt alive, pulsing with a low, rhythmic hum, as if the building itself was breathing, waiting. Her mind screamed at her to escape, but her body felt paralyzed, as if her legs had turned to stone. The whispers in the air grew louder, swirling around her, speaking in a language she couldn't understand, but somehow it all felt familiar. The words twisted her thoughts, making her question if she had ever truly left the apartment in the first place. Had she really run away, or had she been trapped from the very beginning? "Emma," the voice came again, closer this time, but not from the figure. No, this voice was softer, more pleading. It was coming from behind her. Emma spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, except for the shadows, and then she saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a light flickered. A dim, pale light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispers. The light was coming from the door to her old apartment. The door that had been shut, the one she had escaped from. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet moving almost against her will. The figure in the hallway seemed to grow even taller, its elongated limbs swaying unnaturally, as if in time with the humming air. The sounds of its breath, sharp and raspy, were like nails scraping against metal. It reached out toward her, the claws of its hands inches from her skin, but Emma didn't stop. She was drawn to the door, to the light, to whatever lay beyond it. With each step she took, the whispers grew louder, until they weren't just whispers. They were voices calling her name, pleading with her, telling her not to go, warning her that the door wasn't an escape. But Emma couldn't hear them. Not anymore. She had already made her choice. The door loomed before her, and as she reached for the handle, she could feel it. The presence behind her, watching her every movement, its fingers brushing against her back like cold, skeletal hands. The door creaked open with a loud groan that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Inside, everything was as it had been. The apartment was untouched, as if time itself had frozen. The furniture still in place, the air still thick with the stale scent of disuse. But then Emma saw it, the diary. It was lying on the coffee table, its pages open, as if waiting for her. She approached it slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force, and picked it up. The pages fluttered under her fingers, and she was struck by a strange feeling, a sense of déjà vu, as if she had lived this moment before, as if this moment was always destined to happen. She skimmed through the pages, her eyes scanning the words, the symbols. But it wasn't just the words that caught her attention. No, it was something else. A picture, a sketch drawn with trembling hands that seemed to depict her exact likeness. But it wasn't just a picture of her face. No, the picture was of her standing in front of a door, the door to this very apartment, and behind her the shadowy figure, just as she had seen it in the hallway. The diary had known. It had known all along. Emma's fingers trembled as she turned the pages faster, frantically searching for answers, for something that would explain what was happening. And then she found it, a message, scrawled in hastily written ink. "You are the next. You will never leave. This place claims you now." The words echoed in her mind, as if they were alive, reverberating inside her skull. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She wasn't just trapped in the apartment. She was trapped in the cycle, the same cycle the diary had described, the same cycle that had ensnared the previous tenant and the one before that. She had become part of the story, part of the building, part of whatever darkness had been waiting for her. Her eyes darted to the window, the once familiar view of the street outside, now shrouded in shadows. The streets were empty. The world outside no longer seemed real. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen daylight, or if she ever would again. As she stood there, holding the diary, a chill swept through the room. The air turned frigid, colder than it had ever been. The whispers intensified, now clearly audible, surrounding her from every direction. "Emma!" The voice came again, but this time it wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from the other side of the apartment, from the hallway. She dropped the diary, the book thudding softly against the floor, and turned around. The hallway was empty, yet the whispers grew louder, the voices louder, more urgent. The door, the same door, the one she had left behind. It was calling her, and this time she couldn't resist. Slowly, as if in a trance, she walked toward it, each step echoing in the silence, louder and louder with each movement. She could feel it again, the pull, the weight of the building, the pressure of the walls closing in around her. Her hand reached for the handle, and then, before she could open it, the door creaked. It opened on its own. Behind it, a figure stood, not the shadow she had seen before, not the figure from the apartment, but someone she knew, a woman standing there, her eyes hollow, her face pale and lifeless. The previous tenant, and in her hands she held the diary. "Welcome home," the woman said, her voice hollow, her mouth stretching into a twisted smile. "You're just like us now." And before Emma could scream, the door slammed shut behind her. The darkness closed in, forever. As Emma stumbled backward, her heart racing, the overwhelming weight of the darkness crushed her. The woman, the previous tenant, still stood before her, her hollow eyes never leaving Emma's face. The smile twisted and stretched impossibly wide, like a grotesque mockery of joy. "You're just like us now," the woman repeated, her voice rasping as if dragged across a bed of needles. Emma wanted to speak, to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her legs trembling with an unseen force that bound her. The room felt smaller now, the walls pushing in as the woman took a slow step forward. The air, once stale and lifeless, felt thick, saturated with a presence that seemed to cling to Emma's skin. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, breathing, pulsating with something far older and far darker than anything she could comprehend. The whispers had returned, louder now, circling her like vultures. They came from every direction, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They were not just in her head, they were all around her, pressing in. She could feel their cold breath against her ears, their words impossibly close. "Don't fight it. You are part of this place now," the woman said again, each word dripping with a hollow emptiness. "You'll never leave. No one ever does." Emma's hands shook as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the wall, desperate for something solid, something real. But the wall felt like nothing. The surface was slick and cold, like the skin of a living thing. She recoiled in horror, her breath quickening. The woman's smile never faltered as she stepped closer. "We are all here, trapped in the walls, in the dark. The building, it knows us. It keeps us." Emma could feel the air around her growing denser, heavier. It was suffocating, smothering her very will to breathe. She looked around frantically, searching for any way out, but the apartment was a labyrinth now, a maze of shadowed hallways that seemed to twist and shift when she wasn't looking. The door had vanished, replaced by another that led to more hallways. She could no longer tell which way she had come. The woman reached out and touched Emma's arm, her cold fingers sending a jolt of icy fear up Emma's spine. "You'll be one of us soon. You'll understand." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, trying to block them out, but they were inside her head now, inside her heart. The woman's presence was all-encompassing. Emma could feel it creeping into her thoughts, into her soul. She was being consumed, piece by piece. Suddenly, a sharp noise sliced through the thick silence, a loud, echoing bang from somewhere deeper inside the apartment. Emma's head snapped in the direction of the sound, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. She heard it again, followed by another, louder thud, and then the unmistakable sound of dragging, like something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The woman in front of her did not move, did not even react, as if this was all part of the same twisted game. The dragging sound grew louder, coming closer, until it was right outside the room. Emma wanted to run, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't move, not even when the door slammed open with a deafening bang. The figure that entered the room was not the woman, nor was it the shadow that had followed Emma. This new figure was something darker, something far worse. Its body was hunched and contorted, a grotesque collection of limbs that seemed to bend in impossible directions. Its face was nothing but a blur of shadows, a mass of writhing darkness that stretched and pulled, a mouth that opened far too wide to be human. And it was staring directly at Emma. Her heart slammed against her ribs as the figure took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Its presence was suffocating, a heavy weight that pressed down on her chest and stole her breath. The whispers intensified, now all blending into one, a cacophony of voices rising in pitch as the figure loomed closer. "Don't fight it," the woman's voice echoed from behind her. "It's here for you. It's always here." The figure stretched forward, its movements impossibly fast, too fast for Emma to react. It reached out with one of its elongated limbs, fingers like claws, and grasped her wrist. The coldness that radiated from its touch was beyond anything Emma had ever known. Colder than ice, colder than death. She tried to scream, to pull away, but the creature's grip was unrelenting. It dragged her closer, its breath a low, growling rasp that seemed to come from all around her. The shadows around them thickened, closing in, swallowing the light, until Emma could see nothing but blackness. Then the whispers stopped. A deafening silence fell over her. She could no longer hear her own breath, nor the creature's twisted growls. It was as if the world had gone still, as if time itself had frozen in that single, suspended moment. And then she understood. The darkness wasn't just a place. It was a living thing. It had consumed the apartment, the building, the people who had lived there, and now it was consuming her. The creature didn't need to speak. It didn't need to move. It only had to exist. Emma could feel it, the pull, the darkness crawling through her veins, sliding under her skin. It whispered to her, a cold voice that echoed in her mind. "You are home now." The figure released her wrist, its grip loosening, but Emma didn't need to escape anymore. She could feel the walls, the shadows, the very building folding in on her, pulling her into its embrace. And then she was gone. The apartment, the building, all of it gone. For Emma, there was only darkness, and a whisper that would never end. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, as if the very air itself had solidified into something heavy, something that refused to let go. The room, once familiar, had transformed, becoming nothing but an extension of the darkness that had overtaken Emma. The whispers still lingered, but now they weren't just echoes. They were part of the apartment. They were part of the walls, the floors, the ceiling. They were inside her, woven into her mind like a new, twisted reality. It was then that the door creaked open once again, though no one was there to open it. The space that had once been her apartment now seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. The oppressive darkness made it impossible to discern where the walls ended and the floor began. It was as though Emma had been swallowed whole by this building, a place now void of light and warmth. But Emma wasn't alone. From the darkness, shapes began to shift. At first, they were indistinct, shadows that moved too quickly to be fully perceived. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw them more clearly. People, or at least what remained of them. Faces, twisted and contorted, frozen in expressions of terror. Their bodies moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if they were puppets on strings pulled by some unseen force. They were the others, the ones who had lived in this apartment before Emma. They too had fallen victim to the building's curse, trapped within the walls, their fates sealed as they too had been consumed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending together, forming a chorus of torment. They spoke of forgotten lives, broken promises, of people who had come and gone, never to be seen again. And now Emma understood. She was one of them, one of the trapped souls who had become part of the building's twisted, living entity. Her own body felt foreign to her now. She could no longer feel the weight of her limbs, the heaviness of her chest as she tried to breathe. Her movements, too, had become jerky, disconnected, as if she were no longer in control. She had become part of the very thing she had tried to escape. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, the diary, the one she had found so long ago. It was lying on the ground, its pages now stained and torn, as if it had been through the same ordeal as she. It was open to the very last page, where the final words had been written. "They will come for you." Emma reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the page. The words were familiar. They were her words now. The building had consumed her, body and soul, and she was no longer the person she once was. The shadows around her stirred, and she heard the voice of the woman, the previous tenant, whispering in her ear. "You're one of us now. You'll never leave." Emma wanted to scream, but no sound came. She wanted to fight, to resist, but there was no fight left in her. The darkness had won. And so she became part of the apartment's story, just another face in the shadows, just another whisper in the walls. The building had claimed another soul, and the cycle would continue. And that's the end of story.